Our key verse for this conference is found in Micah 6 and verse 8. I'd like to invite you to turn there, Micah 6, verse 8. The Lord writes here, rather Micah is writing under inspiration from the Lord, "He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." I think you've gathered from the topics of each meeting over this weekend that we're going to take a closer look at each aspect of this Bible verse. I've been asked to speak on two topics this evening, Christian justice, and tomorrow morning, Christian mercy. And it's going to be a little bit difficult to speak tomorrow if you haven't been here tonight, because, these two topics are very closely linked together in Scripture. So hopefully for those who are not here tonight, you'll get the recording of tomorrow's meeting and you'll be able to put the two together. But this topic, Christian justice. Now, what is Christian justice? As if to imply that there is other kinds of justice in this world. Christian justice. Well, to appreciate what we're talking of here, when we look at some definitions of justice, I'm going to go to, firstly, the concise Oxford Dictionary of the English language. It defines justice stems from the word just, and just is defined as acting or done in accord with what is morally right and proper, deserved, right in amount, etc. The noun justice is defined as just conduct, fairness, exercise of authority in maintenance of right, due allocation of reward, of virtue, and punishment of vice. And so we have this idea with justice that's associated with right and moral conduct, fairness, exercising authority in the maintenance of what is right, and due allocation of reward for virtue and punishment for vice. And that second thought there, punishment for vice, ties in a little with Webster's definition. Webster writes in there that one definition given in Webster's is vindictive retribution. And when you talk about retribution, what are we talking about? When retribution is, it's punishment, yeah? It's excuse me. I have some water, thanks. It is punishment for something that you've done wrong. In other words, it is, as it says here, it's, thank you, not just punishment, but vindictive punishment. Generally, the idea of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, life for life. And that's done in a vindictive manner. Now, when we talk about the execution of justice, most people have this in mind, that justice has not been done when we're talking about the punishment of a crime. Would you say that's the most common appreciation people have of justice? When justice is not done, or when it is done, it's usually in association with vice that has been adequately rewarded through either a prison sentence or some other fine or whatnot. Do you agree with that kind of idea of when people in their minds, most people in the world think of justice in that way? Do you agree? And so much is this idea prevalent that even in theological circles, this has taken a preeminence over the years. I just want to share a thought from a theologian from about a couple of hundred years ago. In 1795, in fact, this person wrote this. He described the vindictive justice of God as a glorious and amiable perfection of deity. The ejection of the sinning angels out of heaven down to eternal darkness and despair, turning our first parents out of paradise and dooming them and all their race to death, and the final sentence to be passed on apostate angels and apostate men at the day of judgment are all perfect in beauty. The divine character as exhibited to view in these facts is altogether glorious. For it is a glorious thing in God thus to punish sin according to its desert. Therefore, it can be owing to nothing but criminal blindness to the spirit of a rebel, of an enemy in any of God's subjects, that the glory of his character as thus exhibited does not shine into their hearts. And therefore no sooner is a sinner renewed by the regenerating influences of the Holy Spirit, but he begins to see the beauty of vindictive justice. The law is a ministration of death, now begins to appear glorious. For now he begins to see things as they be. For now his eyes are opened, and vindictive justice being a glorious and amiable perfection, it was a glorious and amiable thing in God to bruise Christ and to put his soul to grief, who had espoused our cause and appeared as our representative. So this was a pretty prevalent idea of justice of God, the vindictive justice of God. That is, executing punishment for wrong. Now it's true, our God is not a God to be played around with. He's not a God to be taken lightly. God is the sum of all perfections in their completeness. He is all mercy, all love, and all justice. He is a holy and righteous God, and he will bring sin to an end. He will call men and women to account for their choices, for the choices they have made. Don't get me wrong in this. God will bring sin to an end and will bring men and women to account. But is this the focus of the biblical justice that God is enjoining upon us in Micah 6 and verse 8? When he says, because Micah is asking this question, or the man here is asking the question, Micah says, the question is asked in the context of approaching God. When you come to Micah 6 in verse 8 and look at it in its immediate context, it's about the approaching of God. The question is asked in verse 6, wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? This is the question a person is asking themselves. How shall I, or with what shall I appear before God? What can I bring to him? What can I bow down in his presence with? That I might, in other words, that I might be accepted. The implication is that I might be accepted of him. And the rhetorical question is asked, shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams, or with 10,000 rivers of oil? In other words, will the Lord be pleased with sacrifice? The sacrifice of rams and lambs and bulls. Is that what is necessary to appease him so that I can appear in his presence? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, In other words, shall I give the child, as it goes on to say here, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Shall I give up my own children to the Lord for my sin? Will that make me acceptable before God? And now the answer is given. Will all these things, is sacrifice what God is looking for? Is that what he is asking for? The sacrifice of bulls and rams and goats? Is that what makes him happy? We read elsewhere in the scriptures that the Lord is wearied. He is wearied with these things. Wearied with these sacrifices. Why? What is lacking in these sacrifices? Well, the answer is given in verse 8. What does the Lord require of you? He says here, it's simple. To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. That verse, that question, put it in a way as it is there, I first was impressed by that about 25 years ago when someone sent me an email and it appeared as the tagline in the email. That is their signature line. At the bottom of their signature, they had signed off, and underneath that was this Bible verse. And it has stuck with me ever since. So, what is the context here? Is that God telling us to do justly? That is to exercise retributive judgment for wrong? Is that what is being asked of us to do here? And then also to love mercy at the same time? Well, I want to go a bit further with this to appreciate what the justice is speaking of here. You know, this word in Micah 6 verse 8, this Hebrew word for justice is the word mishpat. And this word, the root of the word appears in about 400 Bible verses. The word itself in the context of justice appears over 200 times in the Old Testament. And it's possible, because of the frequency of this word, that we miss what it's talking about. I mean, whenever you speak about justice, you know what you're talking about. You know, punishment for wrong. That if someone does something wrong, they need to be pulled aside, corrected, or be held accountable for what they've done. But if we look at the word itself in the Old Testament, this word has two major aspects. The first is that this word justice, as used here in the Old Testament, is the standard by which penalties are assigned for breaking the obligations of the society. So it has a relevance to society in general. And that's what we generally understand, that when you break the standards, justice is to be met. Justice is to be executed. But the second aspect of this word justice is something that we perhaps miss a lot in the Bible, and that is this: that it's also the standard by which the advantages of social life are handed out, including material goods, rights of participation, opportunities, and liberties. In other words, this word justice is both the standard for punishment and for benefits. Both punishment and benefits are included in the word justice. And thus, the Bible speaks of justice as a plumb line. I imagine there are quite a bit of plumb lining going on, or plumbing going on here in this construction of this building. You know, plumb lines would have been used here to lay out the foundations for the pouring of the concrete. And the Bible uses justice as a plumb line. If we look here in Isaiah 28, We read here in Isaiah 28 and verse 17. The Lord says here, judgment also will I lay to the line. The word judgment here is the word mishpat, justice, and righteousness to the plummet. Or as the ESV puts it, I will make justice the line and righteousness the plumb line. The Lord has made justice his plumb line. He measures the standard of the building with justice. That's what he's using to measure the standard of the building. And this is what he's using also to measure the well-being of a community or a society. We might look at it, well, in the Old Testament times, it was the society of Israel as a nation. In New Testament times, we could look at it as the society of ourselves as a church. And by extension, because we do have an influence in the world, then it's the measure of our influence in the world at large, whether justice is being done. You know, often we think of justice, as I've mentioned, only as the execution of God's wrath upon evil. Now, it's true that this will take place, and it is mentioned, you know, that Jesus has said that, and in the New Testament, the word condemnation is a parallel thought with the word justice, that is condemnation or judgment. In John 3 verse 18, Jesus said here, John writes here regarding Christ, he that believes on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned or judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. So condemnation or judgment will come upon those who do not believe. But the exercise of God's wrath in execution of justice or judgment is probably more associated with verses like Romans 1 verse 18, where it says there, Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. So God's wrath is revealed from heaven and will be revealed in the execution of that justice upon ungodliness and unrighteousness. So that is definitely one aspect of justice. But the other aspect, very frequently spoken of in the Bible, is that deals with the benefits that are due to a society. Now, various countries, various societies, various cultures deal out benefits to their members of their society based on various priorities. For some, benefits are dealt out based on birth or nobility. For others, it might be based on ability or might. For others, it might simply be the benefits as enshrined in law or established by a contract. But the Bible takes a very different approach. It offers to us a very different approach. When we look at the way God deals with the benefits to be distributed that are due to a society, to the members of a society, we see that these benefits are dealt out according to the need. Turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 18. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 18. Verse 17 tells us that the Lord God is a God of gods. and Lord of lords, a great God and mighty and terrible, which regards not persons nor takes reward. In other words, he has no regard for persons, that is for those who may influence him to be biased in his judgment, nor does he take rewards. In other words, when it comes to the exercise of justice, he doesn't take bribes. He cannot be bribed. But what's verse 18 tell us? God does execute the judgment of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger in giving him food and raiment. Or as the Revised English Bible puts it in this way, the New Revised Standard Version, I should say, the NRSV, puts it this way: God executes justice for the orphan and the widow and loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. So when the God says in Micah 6 verse 8 to do justly, we have now a model. It's the way God does justly. Yes, he does mete out retributive judgment, but he also metes out due benefits. And who do those benefits go to in order to do justice? It goes to the orphan, the widow, and the stranger within the land. We might call those strangers, they are resident aliens, or a common term today would be immigrants. An immigrant, that is someone who's not a citizen of the country, but they've migrated to the country. So these are orphans, the widows, the immigrants. And there's one more primary group as well, not to miss out on them at all, but we see that this one more group is the poor. These are four groups that the Lord particularly emphasizes when it comes to doing justice towards. And it's not the kind of retributive justice that is making sure you punish them right. No, it's making sure that their needs are being met. The widows, the orphans, the resident aliens, or the immigrants if you like, and the poor. This is what we could term the vulnerable quartet. It's often been termed that, the vulnerable quartet. It's these four that will be in every society and that has been in every society ever since the days of societies. And it's upon these four in particular that justice is to be exercised. It's also to be exercised you can get an appreciation of this from Job chapter 29 verses 12 to 17. You can write these down. We won't read these, but Job 29 and verses 12 to 17. Psalms 146 verses 7 to 9, and Malachi chapter 3 and verse 5. But just looking at Job 29 verse 12 to 17, Job says here, because Job here is justifying himself, okay? He's trying to explain to his friends that he has been just. And he says here, because I delivered the poor that cried, and the fatherless, and him that had none to help him. The blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing. I was eyes to the blind, and feet was I to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and the cause which I knew not I searched out. And I brake the jaws of the wicked and plucked the spoil out of his teeth. So Job here, in trying to express the reality of his life as being one of justice, he explained what he did. He delivered the poor. In other words, he met the needs of the poor, the fatherless, the widow. And if there was anyone who was who didn't know about, he would search them out to make sure that all their needs were being met. This was his great argument for doing justice, for being a just man before God. This is, he was actually, justifying himself in all this. But I'm just bringing this out to show you what justice entails. It's reaching out to these ones. It involves also the meeting of the needs of wage earners. You'll find this in Malachi chapter 3 verse 5. I will come near to you in judgment, the Lord says here, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers and against the adulterers and against false swearers and against those that oppress the hireling. How? How do we oppress the hireling? What is a hireling? This is Old Testament, this is King James Version here. What's a hireling? Someone who earns wages for a living, right? They earn their wages. They work for wages. So a person who's a businessman can oppress the wage earner by what? How? By not paying him his wages. By not paying him a just wage. And by not paying him his wages when they are due to be paid. This is how we can oppress the wage earner. And he goes on to say here, the widow, the fatherless, and turn not aside the stranger. So we see them here again. In this case here, the wage earner, but again, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. The stranger is always a term for a sojourner or an immigrant in the land. Okay, so these are the ones that will often need assistance, need help. They are the vulnerable in our societies. And the sick as well. Job focused on the fact that the blind were restored because of his efforts. He has sought out to meet their needs, and the lame as well. So the sick need our help. But these four in particular, remember: the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, and the poor. The measure or the plumb line for a society is its execution of justice, in particular in how it deals with these ones. Any neglect shown to the needs of the members of this quartet is not merely a lack of mercy or charity, because we often, we've established charities, charitable organisations, yes? And is our church a charitable organisation? Are we registered as a charitable organisation? I know we are in Australia, where I'm from. And what does a charitable organisation do? It exercises charity, which is consideration and compassion and love and mercy in meeting the needs of those in society. But in doing that, and being stirred with compassion in doing that, from the biblical perspective, you are in fact executing justice. It's what those ones who are vulnerable in society are due. And so God would require us in the execution of justice to meet these needs. This is what it means to do justice. Now, each of these groups of vulnerables, if you like, will have specific needs. And those needs, if they're not met, when you consider it from the biblical perspective, particularly in the society of Israel as a nation, when those needs were not being met, those classes of people were unable to participate in the aspects of society. They were unable to participate in the community of Israel. And so, justice required those needs to be met. And if they weren't met, life itself was even endangered. The forces which deprive what people are due as a basic necessity for life, or for not just for physical life, but for community life, are condemned as oppression. Let's have a look here. In Micah chapter 2, and verse 2, it says here, rather starting from verse 1, woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds when the morning is light, and they practice it because it is in the power of their hand. And they covet fields and take them by how? How do they take those fields? They covet them and take them by violence. And houses they covet as well and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage. You see, Israel was an agrarian society. They were subsistence farmers, if you like. There are some societies like that still today. I know one of the fields in the South Pacific Union Mission is or a number of the fields in that mission are island nations, and it's subsistence living, particularly in Papua New Guinea. The people there live each day from hand to mouth, basically with what they grow, they eat, and what they have left over. If they need something else, they take it to market, exchange it for cash, and buy what else they haven't got with the cash. It's just subsistence living. And that's why land is precious. Land was what was required to ensure a person could survive. And if a person could survive with their land, they could then participate in the society of that community, as far as the nation of Israel was concerned. So when a person would covet their heritage, which was their piece of land, and take it by violence, that is, rise up against that person and kill them or oppress them in some other way, that God condemns that as oppression. And again, taking a house in the same way. Do you know, have you ever thought about this amongst the children of Israel? And if you can imagine that we were living in a nation, if our church were a nation where we owned collectively the land that we were living on was owned by us, and you know what? Every person or every family had their heritage. That was their land. That was what was required for them to survive. And you know what? If a person came into dire straits to the point where they had to sell their land, guess what? What happened in the year of Jubilee? Every 50 years was a year of Jubilee. What happened in the year of Jubilee? The land returned to the original family. So, you know, it kind of puts a bit of a handbrake on this lust to increase your riches through the acquisition of real estate, and the oppression of the members of the society in doing that. I mean, you can imagine, oh yeah, if the year of Jubilee had just passed, it was now year one, I'm going to go now and buy myself a piece of land. You can imagine that, you know, we have the yearly market cycles. They go up and down according to whether it's Christmas Day, whether it's Easter, or whether it's Thanksgiving. You know, there's a commercial cycle of gift buying. Well, I can imagine there must have been some kind of commercial cycle in land buying in Israel's time. You know, the year of over a 50-year period, the year of Jubilee would end, and there'd be a sudden spike in the buying of land. You know, and as the year of Jubilee approached, the spike, you know, the curve would go down unless land was purchased. You know, and why is that? Because you knew on that 50th year you'd have to do what? Give it back. That's a great system, isn't it? That's a great system. Nobody was to be neglected. Nobody could sell their birthright in that way. If they did, they were destitute for a life of poverty and perhaps even death. And so justice demands that this kind of oppression be avoided. that the needs of every one of these people are met. And what are those basic needs? Well, firstly, as I've already mentioned, it's land. The second thing is what's usually associated with land. If you just have a piece of land, will you survive? What have you got to do with that land? Farm it. You've got to cultivate it. And so what's needed to cultivate it? What do you need to cultivate land? Well, today you would need what? A tractor, or unless you've still got a horse and the hoe or whatever. But at least you need the tractor. In those days, it was the draft animals, the ox, the donkeys, the asses, and also millstones. Because what was the millstone used? The oxes and asses would till the soil, and then they would sow the seed. The landowner would sow the seed. The seed would sprout, grow, and come time of harvest, the corn or the wheat would be harvested. And then what did you need to still? Was that enough? Could you still live like that? What did you then need to do with that wheat, for example? What did you have to do with that? Crush it. And what did you use to crush it? A millstone. And so you can read here in Deuteronomy chapter 22, it says here, regarding the requirements that we are to exercise towards our brethren, if you see your brother's ox or his sheep go astray, don't hide yourself from them. Why not? Because that's that brother's livelihood. And so it says here, thou shalt in any case bring them again to thy brother. And if thy brother is not nigh thee, or if thou know him not, then thou shalt bring it to thine house. And if thou shalt, and it shall be with thee until thy brother seek after it, and thou shalt restore it to him again. In like manner thou shalt do with his ass, and so shalt thou do with his raiment, and with all lost things of thy brothers which he has lost, and thou hast found, shalt thou do likewise, that thou mayest not hide thyself. Thou shalt not see thy brother's ass or his ox fall down by the way, and hide thyself from them. Thou shalt surely help him to lift them up again. So you can see here there was a great concern for these animals because they were the means of gaining that livelihood, the way of a person. And so concerned was the Lord with these things that even in Deuteronomy 24 verse 6, let's have a look here. Deuteronomy 24 verse 6, no man shall take the nether or the upper millstone to pledge. In other words, if a person makes a promise, oh look, I need this here, well what can you give me as a pledge that you're going to repay? Oh, my millstone here? No, that was forbidden. They weren't allowed to pledge their millstones, and you weren't to take the millstone as a pledge. Why not? Because the millstone was what was needed to make the flour that he needed to make bread, that he needed to eat so that he could survive. So you can't take the millstone. If you do, the brother's going to starve until he pays you back whatever he owes you. So they weren't to take millstones, and so much to the point even where in regard to the millstone, it says here, for in taking the millstone, look at the second half of that verse 6, no man shall take the nether or the upper millstone to pledge. For why? It says, he taketh a man's life to pledge. When you take the millstone to pledge, you're taking that man's life to pledge. That's how God regarded it. So do you see here the justice of God in taking care of everybody and making sure their basic needs are met? And what were those needs? Food, number one. Deuteronomy 24 verse, well, we already also read there previously in 22 verses 1 to 4, you couldn't take his raiment either, or if you found his raiment, what were you to do? His clothing, you were to keep it until he came for it or take it back to him. And God promises here in Deuteronomy 24 verse 13, in any case thou shalt deliver him the pledge again when the sun goes down. So that if a person comes with their coat, oh look, can you take my coat as a pledge that I will return with the money and give it back to you? What were you to do with that coat? How long could you keep it for? Only for one day. When the sun went down, you had to give that coat back. So God had a concern for the clothing and also for the shelter. In Psalms 68 verse 6 it says, God sets the solitary in families, he bringeth out those which are bound with chains, but the rebellious dwell in a dry land. So he sets the solitary in families. And in Job 8 and verse 6, if thou were pure and upright, surely now he would awake for thee and make the habitation of thy righteousness prosperous. What these friends of Job were saying to him here, that if you were just, if you were pure and upright, surely God would make your habitation prosperous. Because it would be a habitation of righteousness, and therefore God would bless it and make it prosperous. So God is concerned with the habitations as well, blessing those. You know, Job, if you see there in Job 22 verse 5 to 9, and also verse 23, and then Job 24 verses 1 to 12, it's just emphasizing these aspects, or this reality that the Lord here decries the injustice of depriving people of each one of these needs. And these needs are both material needs and economic needs. There's also a need to recognise due process and judgment. That is, if you turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verses 18 to 20, it says here that judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. A just judgment, or a righteous justice that they shall judge the people with. Thou shalt not wrest judgment, verse 19. Thou shalt not respect persons, neither take a gift, for a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise, and pervert the words of the righteous. That which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live and inherit the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. So the promise of living and inheriting the land which God has given to not just the regular members of the society, but to the judges and rulers as well, was that they were to execute justice. And when it came to judging the people of God, it meant not taking bribes. It meant being no respecter of persons. For the bribe blinds the eyes of the wise. It perverts the words of the righteous. So God is concerned with the execution of righteous judgments. He's concerned with judges who follow due process. Also, if you turn to Deuteronomy 28 and verse 48, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 48, the Lord equates freedom from bondage with not being in hunger, thirst, nakedness, and a lack of everything. Let's have a look here. He says, therefore shalt thou serve God was saying here that if they were to turn away from him and serve idols, he would destroy them from off the land. In other words, he would allow their enemies to come and overtake them, and they would be subject to their enemies, they would be in bondage. And look how he terms it here. You will be in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee. So hungry, thirsty, and naked. Do we as Christians hear those things mentioned often? The hungry, the thirsty, the naked? Didn't Jesus say something about these things? When I was hungry, did you not feed me? When I was thirsty, did you not give me a drink? When I was naked, did you not clothe me? These are the kind of things that Jesus is holding up as a plumb line of character. In other words, the justice of God is the plumb line for our characters. This kind of justice restores people to community. That is, if a person, as I mentioned already, falls into dire straits, has to sell their land, the execution of justice is that that land returns back to that person or that person's family in the year of Jubilee. If the person if you've harvested your land, you've picked your grapes, you are not to go through a second time and take the gleanings. Why not? Who were the gleanings for? They were for the poor. And each year, you were to lay aside a certain portion known as the first fruits. And who did the first fruits go towards? A festival where everybody could come and nobody went away hungry. Everyone was provided for. You see, the execution of justice is always seeking to restore people who have perhaps fallen in dire straits. Maybe there's a person who was once wealthy, they become poor. Maybe there's a person born in poverty. Whatever it is, the provisions of food, clothing, a home, these things endeavour to maintain that person's active participation in the community. You know, justice delivers. It doesn't merely relieve the immediate needs of those in dire straits, but if you look in Psalm 68 verses 5 to 10, I'll give you a couple of references here. Psalm 68 verses 5 through to verse 10. We won't read them all, but I'm just giving you the reference. You can look this up. Psalms 10 verses 15 to 16. And if you compare these with Psalms 107 and Psalm 113 verses 7 and 9, just write those down. But you'll see here that helping the needy means setting them back on their feet, giving them a home which leads to prosperity, restoration, and ends the oppression. Notice this. I'll just read that Psalm 68 verses 5 onwards. A father of the fatherless and a judge of the widows, God is God in his holy habitation. So God is a father of the fatherless. Why? Because he seeks to meet their needs, to ensure they maintain their place in society. He's a judge of the widows. He is in his holy habitation. God sets the solitary in families. He brings out those which are bound with chains, but the rebellious dwell in a dry land. O God, when thou wentest forth before thy people, when thou didst march through the wilderness, the earth shook, the heavens also dropped at thy presence. God, Sinai itself was moved at thy presence. I want to go down to verse 10. Thy congregation has dwelt therein, thou, O God, has prepared of thy goodness for the poor. So God has prepared of his goodness for the poor. And where is his goodness manifested? Where is God's goodness manifested that provides for the poor? Well, Jesus said in Matthew 5 that God makes his sun to shine where? On the just and the unjust, and the rain to come down on the righteous and the wicked. God is no respecter of persons. He makes these blessings to come down that the earth may bring forth her fruits, that there be enough to provide for the poor. And let me ask you a question. We have people starving in this world. Tens of thousands starving every year in other countries. Maybe even in this country, I don't know, but definitely in other countries. My question is there enough food in this world to ensure those people don't starve? Is there enough food in this world? Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Can you judge God for the starving poor? No, you cannot. God has provided for them. Who is the stumbling block? It's sinful man. Sinful man. And in not providing for the starving poor, what are they doing? They are oppressing them. They are oppressing them. So oppression has many forms. But the biblical oppression is not providing for the basic necessities of life to those who are vulnerable and in need. You know, when we do this, we restore these ones, both to life, to health, and to active engagement in our society, both in the church life and in society at large. And thus, God demands, when it comes to us today as Christians, God demands justice. He demands us to exercise justice. Anyone who bears the name of Christ is to go forth and do justly. And what does that mean? It means, for example, when it comes to paying your tithes and giving your offerings, what are you not to neglect? What did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23? Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law. And what were the weightier matters as far as Jesus was concerned? It says here, judgment, mercy, and faith. Or justice, mercy, and faith. You've omitted this in bringing forth your tithes. These ought you to have done. So yes, you should have tithed your mint and your cumin. But you should not have omitted justice, mercy, and faith. In other words, you should not have, in tithing your mint and cumin, you should not have neglected the needs of the poor and vulnerable around you, the widow, the fatherless, the stranger in the land, and the poor. Proverbs 21, in James 1, the apostle brings out clearly to us here what is pure religion. And I want to ask you that question. What is pure religion? Is it coming to every meeting of the church? Is it giving out literature? Is it paying your tithes and offerings? Is it even preaching? Is that pure religion? Oh, it's part of religion, but is that the pure religion and what the Bible terms undefiled religion that's called upon? Do you know what James tells us? James 1 and verse 27. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this. And what is it? We know it is. We know what it is. It's to do what? To visit who? Your friends? To visit your family? To visit those who have done good by you? Who is it to visit? The fatherless and widows in their affliction. Who is it to visit? The orphans and the widows. And widows would be those who without their husbands, who were generally the ones providing for the needs in these days. But so a widow who is without a provider, she would be someone in want. And the orphan has no one to care for them. To visit these ones. That's pure religion. That's undefiled religion. That, brothers and sisters, that is doing justly. I pray when Jesus returns that he finds us among that company that have visited the poor, visited the sick. Remember, what will he say? Blessed are ye, come and inherit the kingdom prepared for you. Why? Because when I was sick, you came and visited me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. And then you'll say, when did we do that? And he'll say, in as much as you've done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me. So may the God help us, brothers and sisters. It says here, in the Desire of Ages, Volume 2 of the Testimonies, 25 to 26, it says here, good deeds are the fruit that Christ requires us to bear. Kind words, deeds of benevolence, of tender regard for the poor, the needy, the afflicted. It goes on to say here, when hearts sympathise with hearts burdened, with discouragement and grief, when the hand dispenses to the needy, when the naked are clothed, the stranger made welcome to a seat in your parlour and a place in your heart, angels are coming very near, and an answering strain is responded to in heaven. Every act of justice, mercy and benevolence makes melody in heaven. The Father from his throne beholds those who do these acts of mercy and numbers them with his most precious treasures. They shall be mine when I make up my jewels. He goes on to say there. Jesus, when he spoke about us visiting those in prison, those who are sick, those who are hungry, giving them food, Jesus identified himself with these ones. In doing so, he identifies himself with his suffering people. It goes on to say here, in the same testimony, it was I who was hungry and thirsty, it was I who was a stranger, it was I who was naked. And so when we do these things to these ones, we do them to Jesus. And if you think about it, this work of justice is what we would call restorative justice. It seeks to express the gospel in a practical way. God exercised justice to this world. How? In two ways. One, by punishing sin. But did he punish sin immediately? No. What did he do? He exercised justice in seeking to restore mankind. The punishment of sin will take place after. We sometimes have it reversed. And in restoring it, mankind, what did God do? Jesus volunteered to bear the wrath for sin, the punishment for sin, that justice might be met in the forgiveness of sin for those that believe in Jesus, and that you and I might be restored to favour with God and into relationship with him in our characters. And that's why Christ, I'm reading from Fundamentals of Christian Education, page 430. Christ's work was to restore man to his original state, to heal him through divine power from the wounds and bruises made by sin. Everyone has been wounded and bruised by sin. Every one of us needs restoration. And as we act our part in seeking to exercise justice in this world, in meeting the needs of the vulnerable, do you know what we're doing? We are expressing the character of God to those people. We are developing the character of God in our life. We are living the life of Christ. We are living the life of righteousness. And so when it comes to the question of salvation and justification, we are justified by faith, but it's also true, and it follows, that the just shall do justly. May the Lord help each one of us to do this justice, is my wish and prayer. Amen.
Amen.